the Bodhisattva Arya Avalokiteshvara looked upon the very practice of the profound perfection of wisdom and beheld those five aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. And then, through the power of Buddha, the Venerable Shariputra said to the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara, how should any son of the lineage train who wishes to practice the activities of the profound perfection of wisdom? He said that, and the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara said this to the Venerable Shariputra. Shariputra, any son of the lineage or daughter of the lineage who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom should look upon it like this, correctly and repeatedly beholding those five aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. Form is empty, emptiness is form. Emptiness is not other than form. Form is also not other than emptiness. In the same way, feeling, discrimination, compositional factors, and consciousness are empty. Shariputra, likewise, all phenomena are emptiness, without characteristic, unproduced, unceased, stainless, not without stain, not deficient, not fulfilled. Shariputra, therefore, in emptiness, there is no form, no feeling, no discrimination, no compositional factors, no consciousness, no eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind, no visual form, no sound, no odor, no taste, no object of touch, and no phenomenon. There is no I element, and so on, up to and including no mind element and no mental consciousness element. There is no ignorance, no extinction of ignorance, and so on, up to and including no aging and death, and no extinction of aging and death. Similarly, there is no suffering, origination, cessation, and path. There is no exalted wisdom, no attainment, and also no non-attainment. Shariputra, therefore, because there is no attainment, bodhisattvas rely on and dwell in the perfection of wisdom, the mind without obscuration and without fear. Having completely passed beyond error, they reach the end point of nirvana. All the Buddhas who dwell in the three times also manifestly, completely awaken to unsurpassable, perfect, complete enlightenment in reliance on the perfection of wisdom. Therefore, the mantra of the perfection of wisdom, the mantra of great knowledge, the unsurpassed mantra, the mantra equal to the unequaled, the mantra that thoroughly pacifies all suffering, should be known as truth, since it is not false. The mantra of the perfection of wisdom is declared, Tadyata gate gate, paragate parasamgate bodhisvaha. Shariputra, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva, should train in the profound perfection of wisdom like that. Then the Bhagavan arose from that concentration and commended the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara, saying, well said, son of the lineage. It is like that, it is like that. One should practice the profound perfection of wisdom just as you have indicated. Even the Tathagatas rejoice. The Bhagavan having thus spoken, the Venerable Shariputra, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara, those surrounding in their entirety, along with the world of gods, humans, ashras, gandharvas, were overjoyed and highly praised that spoken by the Bhagavan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, May I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Hey, welcome everybody. Seems like there are more people here than there were a few minutes ago when I started talking. What I'm going to do tonight is, in broad sense, is I'm going to continue with talking about the second vision, the vision of the profound reality as Buddha nature for the first part, and then transition into looking at Koramba's notion of the third, which is the third vision, that there is a reality that is a middle way that's free from all extremes, that can't be characterized either in the terms that Dolpapa prefers or in the terms that Tsongkhapa prefers. And in order to do that, tonight, I'm going to be sharing many verbatim excerpts and some slightly paraphrased excerpts from texts that I've been translating myself. Because I think I mentioned maybe the first class, I've been translating texts that deal with Madhyamaka from different Dharma traditions, truly different Dharma traditions within Tibetan Buddhism, and from different centuries. So exploring out beyond my home territory of Gelugpa. Yeah, I have a bunch of material translated that's not, some of which hasn't been translated before into English, and some of which I've translated again, even though it was already translated before. So that's what we're going to be doing. So just to reorient everybody, oh, wait a minute, let's see. I'm not sharing my screen. I have to share my screen, otherwise it doesn't do any good. There we go. Okay, so these are the three visions that, this is the same slide that I've shown several times before. 3 ways of talking to guide people toward liberating vision of the profound reality. 3 ways of talking. I'm trying to like emphasize this idea that, yeah, there's different words, the words of the, I heard His Holiness talk about how, you know, Buddha's body, speech, and mind, which is most important, is the Buddha's speech, because it's through the Buddha's speech that we're guided on the path to awakening. Very interesting, right? So speech, silence, whatever choice of syllables or open space between words that you leave in order to serve as medicine to certain people at certain times, right? That's the verbal expression of the Dharma. And it's a separate question as to whether very advanced yogis, you know, in following one tradition or using one set of words to talk to their followers, are actually experiencing something radically different. Now, you know, I'm sort of presenting myself as, you know, inspired by His Holiness the Dalai Lama in doing this kind of approach. That's, and he's said frequently that there has to be a way to realize the awakening in all of the different Dharma traditions of Tibet. So in other words, even though there's very, very different ways of talking, he's not saying that, you know, these traditions have within them some methods or means of guidance that leads people toward awakening. So that's the idea, is I'm thinking, is that different kinds of patterns of words could be helpful to different people. So the first one is the, our home one, to think in terms of the profound reality in terms of emptiness. And then the second one that we talked about all last time is that the profound liberating reality is the intrinsic perfection of Buddha nature as present primordially, beginninglessly within all beings. And the third that we're going to get to tonight is that the profound reality is not accessible to words and thoughts at all. It's ineffable and transcends all dualistic categories. And those dualistic categories include the kinds of words that are used in visions 1 about emptiness and vision 2 about the primordial Buddha nature. In other words, those are the number 3 here. Karma sees number 1 and number 2 as each falling to extremes, and therefore missing the middle way that's free from extremes. So, yeah. So, last time we talked about Dolpapa, and we have one slide who lived in the century before Tsongkhapa, or actually very slightly overlapped in his lifespan with Tsongkhapa in the 14th century. And then I very briefly mentioned JAMGÖN KONGTRÜL LODRO TAYE, who is a 19th century follower of the same, vision of the primordial purity of Buddha nature as being the most profound reality. In other words, profound reality is not a sheer negation, but is this basic goodness, essential goodness, right? That's at the core of all of our being. But actually, one of the most influential writers in that tradition, who didn't mention at all last time, is Taranatha. Taranatha, is a Tibetan who lived from the 16th century to the 17th century. But he had this partially Sanskrit name, Taranatha, Tara the savior, because apparently in his biography it says that a deity appeared to him in a dream and conferred that name on him. So he's part of this, extrinsic emptiness tradition, believing that the most profound reality is empty in the sense that it's empty of the contamination or delusion associated with ordinary appearances. So part of his idea is that all 3 turnings of the wheel of Dharma, we could say that the first turning, let's say the text of the Pali Canon and so forth, the second turning, the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras and related texts, and the third turning, which includes the texts like the Sandhi Nirmochana and the Lankavatara that lay the basis for the Chittamatra system, but also includes the Tathagata Garbha Sutras that we were talking about last time. Those are all in the third turning. So what he's trying to do, and this is typical of Dolpapa, Taranatha, and also JAMGÖN KONGTRÜL, is that they want to say that all these sutras are basically non-contradictory and in some sense teaching the same thing if you know how to read them. And by extension, that means that a Sangha, when he's bringing to us from Maitreya, the Uttara Tantra that teaches about the fundamental purity of Buddha nature, is not saying anything that's contradictory to what Nagarjuna is saying in the treatise on the middle way. This is something that, reading these two things, not as separate systems, but as like 2 ways to talk about the same thing, is characteristic of this whole extrinsic emptiness tradition. So the first turning presents conventional things, but he says this is actually translation, right? He never teaches that it never teaches that things ultimately exist when their way of existing is subject to analysis. So it doesn't have a false word. In other words, so he teaches about the Four Noble Truths and teaches about dependent arising, all the different teachings that are in in the Pali Canon, there's no part of it where it says, yeah, and these are the things that ultimately exist under analysis, right? So it doesn't contradict the second turning, for example. And then the second turning, the middle turning, the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra negates all the phenomena of samsara and nirvana. And the third turning presents all conventional things, while the Sugata Garbha, which is another name for the Tathagata Garbha or Buddha nature, is not analyzed and not taught as either existent or non-existent. Okay, so this is, of course, yeah, harder for us to get our minds around. But this is exactly what Taranatha says. Besides all the phenomena of samsara and nirvana, there's this fundamental reality of the Buddha nature, which is cannot be deconstructed under analysis and is not presented as either. It transcends the duality of saying it exists or doesn't exist. And therefore, the meanings of the three turnings of the wheel, all the scriptures of the Buddha, it's not like you have to go around establishing which ones are definitive and which ones require interpretation, because they don't contradict each other in the first place if you know how to read them. And this is the same thing, by the way, that Dolpapa did in the century before Tsongkhapa, the generation before Tsongkhapa, that he said, not only is this true, what Taranatha is saying, but also, you know, all the tantras and sutras should be regarded as commentaries on one another. They're all spoken by the Buddha. And, you know, when Tsongkhapa talks about sutra, he talks about sutra and he doesn't bring in, you know, a quote from Kala Chakra to explain something that's in the Abhidharma Kosha or something like that. But for the extrinsic emptiness people, it's perfectly reasonable. There's no boundary line between sutra and tantra teachings in the way that we're used to seeing in Gelugpa. So the first turning taught that each and everything can stand up. If the first teaching, the first turning, the Pali Canon, taught that each and everything could stand on its own, then it would contradict the Katyayana Sutra. So the Katyayana Sutra is, we're going to hear more about that later. But this is a sutra where Buddha teaches the middle way. This isn't Pali, this is the Sanskrit reconstruction of its title in Pali. But it teaches the middle way as avoiding extremes of existence and non-existence. And if the second turning were to negate the ultimate expanse of reality and so forth, is that as, in other words, if the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra said that Buddha nature it doesn't exist, then it would contradict the treatises of Maitreya. So in other words, he's going to interpret Nagarjuna as, I wonder, you know, what they do with the chapter of the treatise on the middle way, where Nagarjuna analyzes the Tathagata and finds the Tathagata as being just as unfindable under analysis as, you know, going or and so forth. But anyway, that's the idea, that there's something that is never deconstructed, and therefore that Sugata Garbha or Tathagata Garbha or Buddha nature, and therefore it doesn't contradict the teachings of, you know, Asanga as received from Maitreya. So Taranatha attacks people who hold to the idea that the ultimate reality is that all things are empty of their own nature. Some, such as Tsongkhapa, say that extrinsic emptiness is not reliable. They assert that things exist because they exist conventionally. They accept as existent what does not exist ultimately. This would be Tsongkhapa, right? Taranatha, of course, you know, lived at a time when the Gelugpa Dharma system had come into political dominance, so he knows what they say. They say, you know, they say these things. They do not rely on the ultimate, they rely on the conventional. So what he's trying to do is to say that these teachings of Tsongkhapa, teachings of the Gelugpa order, constitute wrong reliance. You know, they're relying on, they're taking as valid, you know, conventional existence instead of understanding, as Taranatha thinks you should, that, you know, the conventional is all empty, and that means that it's not as real as the ultimate, which is not empty of its own nature. They, that is Tsongkhapa and so forth, accept as existent what exists for the perspective of consciousness. That was what we were talking about the other day. They say that non-existence for the perspective of consciousness constitutes non-existence, and that something may exist even though it does not appear in the perspective of sublime wisdom. Very important, right? So, you know, in Tsongkhapa's system, there's like, you know, when there's a sublime wisdom that's directly knowing reality just as it is, no tables and chairs appear whatsoever. And Tsongkhapa is at pains to show how that does not mean that tables and chairs don't exist. It just means they don't exist in such a way as to appear to this sublime wisdom, which is searching for their ultimate nature. But this, outside the Gelugpa tradition, this is seen as like reifying conventional things, right? And failing to recognize that the profound experience of nirvana, of direct non-dualistic realization of the reality by the sublime wisdom, and say the path of seeing and above, failing to realize that that's what gets to the really real, right? And shows that everything else, all these tables and chairs and people and so forth, are illusory. That is, that they're not, that they're delusory. Yeah, they appear through the power of ignorance. Yeah. So the point is that is accusing Tsongkhapa's system of relying on ordinary consciousness instead of relying on the profound wisdom of an enlightened mind. So they abandon sublime wisdom and rely on ordinary consciousness. This is all still Taranatha. These are his words. To assert that every emptiness is a sheer negation, a lack of true existence, is the faulty understanding of the proponents of intrinsic emptiness. So you can see he's familiar with what Tsongkhapa's teachings are. He just disagrees with them, right? The emptiness of the actual reality is sublime wisdom. Emptiness that is sheer negation is conventional, right? So in other words, there's two different kinds of, quote, emptiness, unquote, right? The emptiness of the actual reality, which we can call Buddha nature, or, you know, the suchness or whatever. Its emptiness is not an emptiness of its own nature. It's an emptiness of all these conventional things. Whereas the emptiness of all these, you know, conventional things, all that lacking their own nature, that's not really even an ultimate truth. It's just a conventional fact. And we could realize that tables and chairs don't exist by way of their own nature. But that doesn't mean we've realized the profound reality. It just means that we've realized another important conventional fact about these things. But it's not the same as realizing the profound emptiness, which is the Buddha nature's emptiness of all these conventional things. Yeah, I know it's a little hard to get used to. So there's emptiness of other. Extrinsic emptiness is the emptiness that refers to how Buddha nature itself, right? And Taranatha is saying, yeah, there is intrinsic emptiness, but that only applies to these deluded things that appear by way of delusion that we're seeing now. And then, you know, he backs this up with quotes from some of the Tathagata sutras. The Tathagata, the Mahaparinirvana Sutra teaches that the Buddha's body is pure, the Buddha's field and so forth are bliss, the ultimate expanse of reality is permanent, and the mind itself is the true self. So the contrary idea is that we are made of flesh and blood, that we have true suffering, that we have momentary parts, that our nature is a lack of true existence. these are wrong views. And, this is how he summarizes the teaching of the Mahaparinirvana Sutra. So this is a very, this appears in Sutra, and it's a very intentional inversion of the, what do you say, older and usual Buddhist idea, right? That we become free from our attachment to things in cyclic existence by realizing impurity of these things, realizing that these things are sources of suffering, our sufferings, realizing that they're impermanent, and realizing emptiness or no self. So in other words, instead of realizing, the impurity, impermanence, suffering, and emptiness, what we really need to realize is purity, bliss, permanence, and true self. And we realize those things not in relationship to tables and chairs or ordinary consciousness, but in relationship to our fundamental nature, which is Buddha's body, Buddha's mind. So what do they do with people like Chandrakirti and Nagarjuna? Says the text, this is the translation, right? This is not my words. The textual traditions of intrinsic emptiness are perfectly valid. And in particular, the proponents of Prasangika, that would mean Chandrakirti, are supreme. But contrary to what Sankama may think, I'm adding in brackets, their refutation of the mind basis of all, the foundation for all karmic seeds, it does not negate the nature of the foundation itself. In other words, there's a fundamental, there's a way in which the mind basis of all at root is really based in Buddha nature itself. And you can have an argument in the Prasangika tradition against saying, that they're karmic seeds that get stored in the storehouse consciousness, but that doesn't deny the fact that the very root of the foundation of the mind is Buddha nature. And the similar things with reflexive awareness. They refute true existence for the dependent nature, not for the thoroughly established nature. So in other words, the thoroughly established nature means, refers to Buddha nature, and its true existence, according to Taranatha, is its true existence is not refuted by Prasangika even. There is a truly existent reality, and that's Buddha nature. The continuum of clear light that is the nature of one's own mind is never cut, and these things are never refuted in Madhyamaka texts, which seems to be true because they don't talk about them, right? And that's part of his point. Since they don't talk about that, you can't. It's an extrapolation to say that these texts have refuted that. That's his point. They don't discuss the foundational sublime wisdom. They don't make a determination about whether it exists or not. He's not saying that Prasangika is teaching all the things that he believes. He's just saying it doesn't refute the things that he believes, right? And so forth. It's compatible with what. So do you see what I'm saying? It's not like he thinks that he's picking somebody else over Chandrakirti or Baba Viveka. He's just saying this understanding of the fundamental that the fundamental nature of is Buddha mind isn't something that's being deconstructed in these Madhyamaka texts. So this is actually a passage that Taranatha pulls out of a Perfection of Wisdom Sutra. This is Buddha speaking. Subhuti, the non-deceptive subject, nirvana, that phenomenon is not illusory. This quote dispels the Taranatha claims. This dispels the claim that the two truths are equally existent and equally non-existent. So this would be Tsongkhapa's point of view, right? Neither the ultimate truth nor the conventional truth exist ultimately. Both the conventional truth and the ultimate truth exist conventionally. There isn't anything in Tsongkhapa's system that doesn't exist. Anything that exists conventionally, because that's the only way that things can exist. We talked about that in the first few classes. So Taranatha thinks that this is wrong. There is something that is really real and other stuff that deceptively appears as though it were. And we have to make that distinction. And then he quotes that he thinks proves his point, the Samadhi Raja, King of Concentration Sutra, which Tsongkhapa also quotes quite a lot. But it's questionable as to whether it really establishes what Taranatha thinks. But this is what he says: know to be instances of definitive sutras those that teach emptiness as explained by Sutta. Know to be provisional all teachings that speak of sentient beings, persons, or living beings. So there's a sense that, okay, so let's read this from Taranatha's point of view. He's saying when the Buddha teaches about sentient beings, persons, that these are provisional because they're not ultimately real. And when the Buddha teaches about emptiness, those teachings are definitive because the emptiness is ultimately really real, because it's the emptiness of Buddha nature being empty of all these illusory things. So, of course, this is not how Tsongkhapa interprets. Tsongkhapa quotes the same passage, but he doesn't interpret it this way. But he's trying to argue that this kind of text that sets the definitive above the interpretable and puts the conventional truths as being the things that are found in interpretable texts, that therefore means that it's not consistent with the Buddha's teaching to say these things are equally real, equally unreal. So this is a quote, right? This is translation, right? So he's kind of, I don't know, taunting a little bit or something, saying, does this passage not say that? It definitely does. So then he's well aware that, and this this came up actually in one of the emails I've gotten from people attending this series of talks, that from our point of view, and also Sonam Thakur wrote the book, The Two Truths Debates. This whole idea that from our point of view, these kinds of teachings seem to be much more like Vedanta than Buddhism, as Buddhist philosophy as we've understood it. So he responds to that. He says, some, and that would be Gelugpas, say that the tradition of extrinsic emptiness is similar to the non-Buddhist Sankhya school, one of the other schools. And to say that a Mahayana textual tradition, that is ours, our extrinsic emptiness tradition, his Taranatha's, is similar to those of non-Buddhists is crazy talk, inspired by the demon of jealousy. And then he turns it, that's all he says about that. He doesn't go on to try to defend exactly why his view is different from Sankhya. Instead, he turns it around and says, our way of looking at things, right, where even the ultimate is empty, that emptiness is empty of its own nature, everything is empty of its own nature. He's saying you can actually find that view in Hindu texts, right? And this is what he tries to prove. In some way, non-Buddhist texts do have the same view as not the proponents of extrinsic emptiness, as Tsongkhapa's followers claim, but they actually have the same view as proponents of intrinsic emptiness. And this was news to me when I translated this text. I hadn't actually heard this argument before, having it, you're really a non-Buddhist in your philosophy turned around against Tsongkhapa's followers. And I'd never seen these quotes before. So he quotes this text, which I don't know exactly what it is, called Adorning Ishvara, Ishvara meaning like God, basically, right? Adorning Ishvara. The real has no real nature, and the unreal has no real nature. Complete freedom from the real and the unreal. Anyone who understands this knows the reason. And then the same text says, O son, Brahma, the supremely true and boundless Lord of knowledge, is proclaimed to be only existent. And yet, even he is said to disintegrate. Okay, so these are quotes that kind of, especially the first one, I would say, but you can see where the second one could align with it. You know, there's this most ultimately real thing, but even it is subject to even it is composite or subject to dependent arising, we could say. And then the first one as well does seem to sort of, it's hard to see how that would be, that quote just isolated would be different from Tsongkhapa's view. He says some texts of Nagarjuna, he admits that some of the teachings of Nagarjuna and Aryadeva seem to be saying something like the intrinsic emptiness view, right? But then he points out that also there's a bunch of other texts by Nagarjuna, or, you know, traditionally believed to be by Nagarjuna, his collection of praises, 5 stages, essay on the Bodhicitta Vivarna, the essay on the awakening mind, that these other Nagarjuna texts seem to have a different philosophical view that's much more easily reconciled with the extrinsic emptiness point of view. And having read those texts, I kind of agree. I think it's very clear that, you know, the main texts that we associate with Nagarjuna and Aryadeva teach that all things are empty of their intrinsic nature. It's not just that they're slightly close to it. That is what they teach. And when you look at some of the later texts that are attributed to Nagarjuna, it's yeah, it's arguable that they're talking about Buddha nature in some places. Therefore, Nagarjuna can be taken in terms of both interpretations. Know that, in fact, the tenets of Nagarjuna and Sangha are the same. This is what I was telling you a minute ago. He's not going to say, yeah, we're going to pick a Sangha over Nagarjuna. He's saying they're actually saying the same thing if you understand them properly. And Ratnakara Shanti and Shantarakshita clearly explain this. So these are people who are, Ratnakara Shanti and Shantarakshita are Yogacara Svatantrika Madhyamakas. So that means that they are followers of Nagarjuna in that they're part of the Madhyamaka system, but within that, they adapt into their teachings many of the ideas from the mind only or Chittamatra tradition as well. So they're not seeing a contradiction between Nagarjuna and the Sangha. And this is quote still, you know, these are translations. All phenomena are empty. That is the extrinsic emptiness tradition. When you see that, you're like, no, it isn't. You guys are saying that there's something that's not empty. Well, you have to remember, emptiness means 2 different things for them, you know. All phenomena are empty and could mean that phenomena are all these delusory things and they're empty of their own nature. Or it could mean all phenomena, including the noumenon or Buddha nature, they're all empty, but in different ways. You know, all the ordinary conventional phenomena are empty of their own nature, but Buddha nature is not empty of its own nature. It's empty of all this other stuff, right? So it's empty in a different sense. And then this is right, all quotes. Since intrinsic emptiness transcends Chittamatra, it's Madhyamaka, but it's not the final Madhyamaka. It's mere emptiness. It's not the final emptiness. It is the definitive meaning, but it's not the final definitive meaning. So all this way of talking comes to Taranatha from Dolpapa, Sherak Gyaltsen, who you know, was criticized by Rendawa and then criticized by Tsongkhapa, and had lived just before them. So our final assertion is not Madhyamaka per se, but rather Maha Madhyamaka, the great Madhyamaka, a Madhyamaka that understands that the real Madhyamaka point of view incorporates the teachings of the Uttara Tantra about Buddha nature as the fundamental reality. If the intrinsic emptiness tradition's freedom from elaborations is a sheer negation, then it cannot be experienced by anyone. There is no experience at all of an unreality. Well, to really understand that, we have to like say that he's actually criticizing Karamba there, not Tsongkhapa so much, because this is Karamba's phrase, freedom from elaborations. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. He's been saying if this is the ultimate nature, is freedom from elaborations, then it's not anything anyone could actually experience. Insofar as thought is mere conceptualization, taking a universal image as its object, you are prevented from labeling it as a realization. Okay, so as to your claim to reliably know the conventional is to ascertain that it does not exist ultimately, we have to repudiate such a shameful view. So of course, he's not very nice toward the Gelugpa position. We have to analyze your statement. All things exist for the unexamined perspective of the world, but do not exist for analysis. This is exactly what Tsongkhapa says, right? And this explains succinctly in a sentence his view, you know, that conventional things exist until you ask the question, what are they really, you know, and try to pin down their ultimate nature. And then you find that there is no findable nature in that way. Right. So, I mean, to me, this makes perfect sense, but he thinks it's ridiculous. You say conventional things do not exist ultimately, they exist conventionally. This means that in the face of analysis, there's no distinction between the mundane conventional and the ultimate. Right. So he thinks it's absurd. I mean, in Tsongkhapa's system, it's not absurd to say that the conventional exists conventionally and the ultimate exists conventionally. But he thinks that this is, you know, absurd on the face of it. According to these later Madhyamaka assertions, by that he means the assertions of Tsongkhapa and also people like Karamba in the Sakya tradition. According to these later assertions, the conventional exists. And if the conventional exists, then sublime wisdom must be mistaken. Why? Because none of these conventional things appear to sublime wisdom. Only ultimate reality, the true fundamental nature of things, appears, right? And Tsongkhapa agrees that, you know, the sublime wisdom that's the antidote to cyclic existence is a mind to which nothing appears except the profound reality, right? But his argument is that doesn't mean that other things don't exist. It's just that that sublime wisdom has seen into their fundamental nature. So the basic reality doesn't change. Sentient beings definitely have a Dharmakaya. At first, it is not the Dharmakaya, but transforms into that later. The actual reality is uncompounded. It's a consciousness that transcends things and non-things. It's irrefutable. It's a visionary perspective of sublime wisdom. Its object is unmistaken. So, therefore, the ultimate expanse of reality, like Dharma Dhatu, it's difficult to know how to translate these things. Chirgying in Tibetan, the sphere or domain of what's really real, this truly exists, and nothing else does. Conventional consciousness is a deceptive phenomenon. So this expansive reality is itself the ultimate consciousness. The actual reality of the expanse is virtuous, for it is the ultimate virtue and the supreme virtue. So this, you know, you can find this view in the contemporary teachings of Shambhala International, right? Which is in the Kagyu lineage, right? Where the contemporary way of teaching this in the West is that, you know, do you or do you not believe in basic goodness? And by basic goodness, they're saying that this is what they're talking about, the Samantabhadra, the idea that the fundamental nature of as human beings is not morally neutral, but is somehow virtuous. So the densely arrayed sutra, that's the Ganda Vyuha, says all the Buddhas teach that the foundation for all the different grounds is the virtuous Sugata Garbha. And they call that foundation of all the essence, right? So this is more Asanga is quoted as saying, what is the ultimate virtue? It's actual reality itself. So these texts teach that the sublime wisdom is the foundation of all. And since it is the ultimate reality, the sublime wisdom is virtuous. It is not the foundation consciousness. The foundation of all is taught to be the Sugata Garbha, right? So the ordinary, what do you say, mind-only version of the foundation consciousness is not the same as the true foundation of all, right? A deeper foundation than the alaya vijnana, the Sugata Garbha, the real foundation. Oops. The actual reality explicitly said to be the cause of enlightenment is explained to be uncompounded. I mean, I always have a hard time when I read these things, is like, how is the Dharmakaya supposed to be the cause of something? You know, if it's also permanent, how is something going to be the cause of enlightenment if it's perfectly uncompounded? But, you know, this isn't the same terms in which they're thinking. And then just briefly, we'll revisit this 19th century guy, and then we'll go on to look at the third vision. JAMGÖN KONGTRÜL LODRO TAYE was the founder, usually they say one of the three founders, but for, you know, he was the first of the three founders of the RIME movement in the 19th century. The RIME movement is like, means non-sectarian or ecumenical, you know, in doctrinally inclusive. Is an important movement in 19th century and early 20th century Tibet, and it still has its influence now, that says we have to look beyond the boundaries of our traditional Dharma lineages. And, you know, Nyingmas should understand the Kagyapa texts, and Kagyapas should learn the Nyingma texts and also look at the Sakya texts. And maybe even a few people will go way out on a limb and read some Gelugpa texts too. And this was like very successful, you know, this collaboration of the different Dharma traditions in Eastern Tibet, you know, pulled together, created a lot of intellectual ferment and creativity, because all these teachers, instead of just reading the books that their teachers wrote, we started reading, you know, learning the vocabulary and the way of thinking, you know, that had been passed down in other Dharma traditions as well. And it created a ferment. And you wouldn't have somebody like Mipam, right, coming along later in the 19th century if it hadn't been, he's part of this movement, and he's sort of the, what do you say, peak flowering of it, because he totally understands Tsongkhapa's position, right, as well as all the positions of the other schools. And he tries to, you know, synthesize them, but of course, it's in a way that Gelugpas will definitely not accept. Anyway, so JAMGÖN KONGTRÜL quotes, he says, quotes the descent into Lanka: relying on mind only, do not imagine external objects. Relying on non-appearance, pass beyond mind only. Relying on seeing reality, pass beyond non-appearance. The yogin who stays in non-appearance does not see the Mahayana, right? So this is very clearly saying that the Chittamatra school, mind only, helps you get beyond the reification of external objects. The perfection of wisdom sutras help you get beyond the reification of mind, right? But that's not enough. When you see the true reality, right, then you pass beyond appearance and non-appearance. And if you just stick with non-appearance in sheer emptiness, right, where nothing, only a sheer negation appears, then you haven't really seen the meaning of Mahayana as the perfect virtue of the Buddha mind and the Buddha body. At least, I don't know if that's that's not in the descent into Lanka in that way, but that's what JAMGÖN KONGTRÜL thinks that it means. You have to go beyond a sheer negation, an emptiness that's a sheer negation. There's no negating the clear, sublime wisdom of reflexive awareness, along with the many good qualities of a Buddha's freedom. This is all in line with what Dolpapa taught. The very experience, but this is a 19th century version of it. The very experience that naturally and spontaneously arises through the three trainings, hearing, contemplating, and meditating, is already present within the basis to be purified. It's hard for me to, put this into my mind, because I have a Gelugpa-based mind. He's saying that somehow the experience that you will attain through training in the path is somehow already there in your mind right now. But you're right, yeah. And it's waiting, it's waiting to be uncovered rather than, so you're not through the practice of the path. You practice the path, right? But as you practice it, you're not getting something new. You're uncovering the experience that in a deeper way you've always already had. That's the way you have to think of it. And the Angulimala, which is of course another Tathagatagarbha sutra, says, the teaching on Tathagatagarbha means that whether one has mental afflictions or not, they are complete Buddhas. Okay, I think that wraps it up. So we have the three visions, and now we're going to vision number 3. The profound reality is not accessible to words and thoughts. It's ineffable and transcends all dualistic categories. Okay, so what follows is, well, first I'm going to give some sutra quotes that relate to the idea of freedom from extremes. And then we'll be looking at some translations by Goramba. Even though the great Madhyamakas in India often, this is Goramba, differ in how they explain texts and use terms, there does not seem to be any difference at the heart of their final philosophical view, right? So, saying there's Svatantrikas, there's Yogacaras, Svatantrikas, Bhavaviveka, there's Chandrakirti, but Tsongkhapa thinks they're all saying something different, and they're all divided up into, tenet systems and sub-tenet systems. But he's like, well, no, it's like they're all really saying the same thing when you understand it. But in Tibet, those who claim to be Madhyamakas have 3 different positions at the core of their final philosophical view. And you can see that this is basically the structure of my whole series of talks comes from this passage. There's those who put forth an extreme of eternalism as the middle way. That's what we've just been hearing about with Buddha nature. Those who put forth an extreme of nihilism as the middle way. And it's maybe disturbing to find out that's what he thinks is the case with Tsongkhapa. And those who put forth freedom from these extremes as the middle way, which of course is going to be his point of view. So I wanted to show that both in the Pali Canon and in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, you can see this idea of transcending extremes, transcending dualistic extremes as being the path. Rather than, we know there's passages that, Angulimala and so forth, where you could talk about the ultimate reality is Buddha nature. And there's also Perfection of Wisdom Sutras where you can see the ultimate reality talked about in terms of emptiness. But what I'm trying to point out here is it's not that Goramba is just making this up. There's other passages we can point to in the Pali Canon, and there's passages we can point to even in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras that mostly talk about emptiness, where what they seem to be saying is that the true reality can't be captured by any kinds of words, whether you call it basic goodness or you call it emptiness. In either case, you've missed the mark. So this is the Katyayana Sutra that was referred to earlier, but it's we have it in I think there's been a Sanskrit reconstruction of it, but it was we have it in the Pali version as part of the Pali Canon. And the Buddha's teaching to Katyayana, the world in general, Katyayana inclines to 2 views: existence and non-existence. But for him who with the highest wisdom sees the uprising of the world as it really is, non-existence of the world does not apply. And for him who sees with highest wisdom the passing away of the world as it really is, the existence of the world does not apply. The world grasps after systems. This is still the Buddha talking in the Pali Canon, as imprisoned by dogmas. But he, this well-instructed person, does not go along with system grasping, mental obstinacy, and dogmatic bias, does not grasp at it, does not affirm, this is myself. It's hard for us to really, avoid dogma grasping, honestly, right? I think in trying to be open-minded, fair descriptions of these other systems, which are not my home point of view, right? I feel like I'm doing an exercise in trying to remember that my point of view is a construct of thoughts and words that works for me to help me in many ways, including help me make sense out of the world. Yeah, all these systems never are perfect representations of reality just as it is, and other people can have other ways to do it. He knows without doubt or hesitation that whatever arises, this is the well-instructed person, whatever arises is merely dukkha, that what passes away is merely dukkha, and such knowledge is his, not depending on anyone else. This, Kaccayana, is what constitutes right view, right? Everything exists as one extreme, nothing exists as the other extreme. Avoiding these extremes, the Tathagata teaches the doctrine of the middle. And then the middle, this opens up the latter part of the sutta, where the Buddha goes on to recite the 12 links of dependent arising and so forth. So yeah, the middle way is dependent arising, avoiding the extremes of reifying existence and reifying non-existence. Okay, so that's a kind of, what do you say, arguably a precursor of Karmba's point of view in the Pali Canon. And then I thought I'd share with you a little in terms of a second turning of the wheel, excerpts from Bob Thurman's translation of the 9th chapter of the Vimalakirtinirdeşasutra. All these monks who are followers of the Buddha have been sent by the Buddha over to visit the layman Vimalakirti, who has manifested illness for the sake of creating a Dharma teaching opportunity. And in the 9th chapter, he asks the bodhisattvas who have gathered there, "Good sirs, please explain how bodhisattvas enter the Dharma door of non-duality." And so then the whole chapter is taken up with bodhisattva after bodhisattva after bodhisattva after bodhisattva, and they all give some, in many cases, quite different way of thinking about what non-duality actually means. So Bodhisattva Srikuta says, defilement and purification are the duality. And when there's thorough knowledge of defilement, there's no conceit about purification, right? Think about the Heart Sutra saying, there is no attainment and no non-attainment, there's no stainlessness and there's no stain. There's no incompleteness and no completeness. It's like that, right? Another bodhisattva says, talking about meditation, right? Distraction and paying attention are a duality. When there's no distraction, there is also no attention, no mentation, no mental intensity. Another bodhisattva says, grasping and non-grasping are a duality. What is not grasped is not perceived, and what is not perceived is neither presumed nor repudiated. And another bodhisattva says, good and evil are a duality. Seeking neither, the understanding of non-duality of the significant and the meaningless is the entrance into non-duality. And another bodhisattva says, to say this is happiness and that is misery is dualism. One who is free of all such calculations through the purity of sublime wisdom, gnosis, his mind's like empty space and he enters into non-duality. This is actually a pretty big theme in the Vimalakirti Sutra, of course, that the bodhisattva doesn't cling to nirvana any more than she clings to samsara. And the bodhisattva Vidyudeva, knowledge and ignorance are a duality. The natures of the two are the same. And another bodhisattva says it's dualistic to refer to the aggregates on the one hand and the cessation of the aggregates of the other, because when you understand how things really are, you see things rightly, the aggregates themselves really are cessation, which is the same thing the Heart Sutra, right, is saying when it says form is emptiness. Another bodhisattva said duality is perceptual manifestation, non-duality is objectlessness. Another one says it's dualistic to detest the world and rejoice in liberation. And when all these bodhisattvas and a bunch of other ones that I edited out give their explanations, they speak to Manjushri, who had sort of was their leader in going over there to visit Vimalakirti. What do you say is the bodhisattva's entrance to non-duality? And Manjushri says, you've all spoken well. Nevertheless, all of your explanations are themselves dualistic. To know one teaching, to express nothing, to say nothing, to explain nothing, to announce nothing, to indicate nothing, to designate nothing, that is the entrance to non-duality. So in other words, he's pointing at the emptiness of all their dualistic explanations by using more words himself, right? And then Manjushri says to Vimalakirti, so we've all given our explanations of non-duality, which you ask us for. What do you have to say? And Vimalakirti, who's here represented in dialogue with Manjushri, doesn't say anything. And at that, Manjushri applauds him. This indeed is the entrance into non-duality of the bodhisattvas. Here there is no use for syllables, sounds, or ideas. Okay, so my point in quoting all this is not to prove that silence is better than speech. It's not, and the sutra makes that really clear if you read the whole thing. But rather to say that this kind of idea that there's something that goes beyond being able to be talked about that is the most profound sort of non-duality beyond any kind of dualistic extremes of being or non-being, to be or not to be, beyond to be and not or not to be, there's something that we can't express, right, using words. This is what Karamba thinks. And so he thinks that Dolpapa and his followers are wrong. And he also thinks that Tsongkhapa and his followers are wrong. And he's going to line Dolpapa up with the people who say being. And he's going to line Tsongkhapa up with the people who say non-being. And he does that in terms of looking at their views of the ultimate, not their views of the conventional. So in other words, the short version is he thinks that the extrinsic emptiness people, the Buddha nature people, they reify the ultimate in something that's not empty. Whereas Tsongkhapa's side, they take something that is a sheer negation as the ultimate, and they talk about it in those terms, therefore falling to an extreme of nihilism that is denigrating or pulling down into language on the negative side only the nature of fundamental reality. So this is Karamba speaking. The explanation of the omniscient Dolpapa Sherab Gyaltsen, preeminent in his wisdom and compassion, a lord of practice and realization. He claims that his position is free from the extreme of permanence because conventional things are empty of their own nature and because they are primordially non-existent in the reality that is the ultimate truth. He claims that his position is free from the extreme of nihilism because reality itself, the fully real, insofar as it has never been non-existent, is primordially true, permanent, and so forth. So this is how Karamba sums up, the Buddha nature position. Interesting, just to notice how he praises Dolpapa before describing his position and then trashing it. And that he praises him both in terms of wisdom, compassion, practice, and realization. So I guess he's accepting that he's a great yogi. Therefore, Dolpova claims that the path beyond, the path of great Madhyamaka, not ordinary Madhyamaka, path of great Madhyamaka is free from extremes. And then he takes on Tsongkhapa, and he spends a lot more time on Tsongkhapa, but first he describes Tsongkhapa's view. With fine analytical intelligence, the Eastern Tsongkhapa Losang Chakpa commented by his own power on the meaning of scriptures. Okay, so already, already there's an implicit trashing of Tsongkhapa just in the way he words this. He commented by his own power. In other words, he wasn't inspired by Maitreya or the Buddha. It was his own innovation, right, to say what he thought and make some stuff up, right, because he was thought he was a smart guy. That's the implication. Yeah. He was beautifully adorned with virtues such as compassion and the mind of awakening. Very interesting. He doesn't say anything about Tsongkhapa actually being wise. He has intelligence, compassion, mind of awakening, but he doesn't actually attribute omniscience or wisdom to him. From him, we have many texts in which there appear unique positions. So you have to understand that unique positions is a cut. If they're unique, that means he made them up and they're not authentically in the lineage that comes down from Buddha. Such as the view that the philosophical heart of Prasangika Madhyamaka is something that neither Indian Svatantrika masters nor any earlier Tibetan Madhyamakas has understood. Well, if you read Tsongkhapa, he does say that. He says the Svatantrikas are wrong, even the Svatantrikas in Indian are wrong, and that earlier Tibetans had totally misunderstood Chandrakirti and the whole Madhyamaka system. So he does think these other people are wrong, and that's why, he's inspired, and guided in his understanding by Manjushri to rely on Chandrakirti. Right down to the glorious Sakya scholars such as Rendawa, all of the scholars and adepts of Tibet have been unanimous in personally meditating on teaching to others, as though all singing the same song, the view of Madhyamaka as, and this is the key phrase, freedom from extremes. Among commentators on the meaning of Mahayana Sutras, Nagarjuna and Asanga are both reliable. So in that way, he agrees with Dolpapa. In Nagarjuna's text, one finds two types of emptiness: an emptiness of rational analysis and the emptiness of individual yogic knowledge. Right? This is so interesting, right? It's like there's two types of emptiness. There's the emptiness that you can think about, and then there's the emptiness that yogis realize, right? Which goes beyond thinking, right? The other type of emptiness that's realized in an indescribable way by sublime wisdom of Arya's personal yogic knowledge. This is what's called ultimate truth. We call it ultimate truth, but words cannot teach this in terms of any extreme, whether something extra is being constructed, such as existing or non-existing, such as eternalism or nihilism, or such as it being empty or non-empty. In other words, freedom from extremes is the basic reality. And if you say, is it empty or is it not empty? Tsongkhapa says it's empty, Dolpapa says it's not empty. He says, that's why they're both falling to extremes. That's exactly what Buddha said not to do in the Kaccayana Sutta, right? Rather, this thing we call ultimate truth transcends any reference of conventional terms. It is the nature of illusion-like dependent arisings, however they may appear. And there's nothing that exists otherwise than as having freedom from extremes as its basic reality. So then he trashes, Dolpapa's system. It's inconsistent with the treatises of Maitreya, Sangha, and Vasubandhu to say that the perfect nature, thoroughly established nature, truly exists and is extrinsically empty, in that it's empty of dependent nature and imputational nature. Yeah. The system of Dolpapa therefore falls outside the meaning of the whole Mahayana Sutra collections, the commentaries on it, as well as the Chittamatra and Madhyamaka philosophical systems. And in trashing Dolpaba in this way, Karamba basically agrees with Tsongpa. So Tsongpa says it in a slightly different way. It's clear that this is exactly what he means. And then more time spent on trashing Tsongkhapa, accusing Tsongkhapa of nihilism. Tsongkhapa says the root of all faults is the conception of truth that grasps at things as true, and that it is therefore necessary to repudiate the constructed object of that conception. That is what Tsongkhapa says, and Karamba agrees. In this, they are quite correct. However, they also claim that the actual ultimate truth is just an utter negation, a sheer negation, a non-affirming negative, an emptiness that is the mere absence of a truth that cannot be found when it's sought by reason. Well, that is what Gelugpas claim. And they claim that the manifest conceptualization of emptiness in this way is not something to be refuted. This is what Tsongkhapa says. He says, when you have the idea and the conceptual realization and understanding, wow, all these things look like they exist just by their own power, but now I understand that they really don't, right? I get it, right? All right, Tsongkhapa says very clearly, if you have this understanding that things are truly empty, that's not something to be refuted. That's something to build on and take up to a deeper yogic level. And this is something that Karamba rejects, saying you can't become attached to emptiness. In this way, their position falls outside the Madhyamaka tradition. So the actual ultimate transcends the mental objects of ordinary beings. Even the stainless sublime wisdom of an Arya's meditative equipoise loses all dualistic appearance of it and does not see it in terms of any extreme, such as existence, non-existence, eternalism, or nihilism. Well, Tsongkhapa would agree with that, right? The stainless, the non-dualistic direct perception of the profound reality transcends all dualism, and nothing appears to it but this basic reality itself. So really, the problem is that we want to say that mind that's realizing the fundamental nature is realizing emptiness. And he's saying that when you say that mind realizing the fundamental nature is realizing emptiness, you're choosing to characterize it in terms of one pole between the positive and the negative. And just as Dolpapa and those guys choose to insist on basic goodness, you're insisting on basic emptiness. And it really goes beyond either of those extremes. That's what Karamba is trying to say. And he has, Shanti, there's lots of quotes that he can find, as I've tried to show, that can be interpreted in terms, and of course, Bodhisattva Charyavatara, Shantideva, has this famous passage that says, ultimate is not the domain of awareness. We hold that awareness is conventional. So, Karamba understands this, and actually all non-Gelugpas understand this, right? As being that any kind of conceptual construction of what the ultimate reality is not getting at the actual ultimate reality, all right? But in Gelugpa, otherwise, we think, yeah, you can conceptually understand and conceptually realize emptiness, right? And that emptiness that you have studied and realized is what you then know directly in yogic realization, right? So he explains the Shantideva quote. So we have to classify as a conventional truth the utterly negative emptiness that's explicitly apprehended by an inferential reasoning conscious that looks for the truth. So when you analyze how does this table exist, and you think and you realize it can't be found in any of its parts, and it's not the mere collection of its parts, and yet you can't find it separate from its parts either, and you realize that it's unfindable, right, in the basis of imputation, then you realize this negative emptiness, right? But he agrees actually with Dolpapa and Taranatha and so forth, and saying, yeah, there is that negative emptiness. It is something that we should realize. But when you realize it, you haven't realized the profound reality, right? And both of them actually say, unlike Gelugpa, that this sheerly negative emptiness that we realize conceptually is actually a conventional truth. I want to see where I was. So there is this thing in Bhava Viveka, there's a thing in Indian Madhyamaka distinguishing between, I could say, a concordant ultimate or something that is like an honorary degree. Like, it's like that. You can compare it to this. Having an honorary doctorate degree versus having a doctorate degree. They're both doctorate degrees, but one is a doctorate degree in an honorary sense, as opposed to based on a person having gone through the curriculum that they normally would. Maybe like that. So there's two different kinds, Bhava Viveka and other Indian Madhyamakas talk, especially Bhava Viveka, talks about, there's the ultimate in that through logic, and that is concordant. That's a concordant ultimate. It's a similitude of what one realizes when one realizes nirvana, right? And this is what, and Tsongkhapa, knows all that vocabulary and so forth. But there's a kind of insistence in the Gelugpa system that emptiness is, that you realize emptiness as an object with different kinds of minds, but it's still emptiness. You realize it with a conceptual mind and it appears in a certain way, but the cognitive content of it is the mere absence of essential nature. And that cognitive content of the sublime wisdom, which is, non-dualistic perception, yogic experience of non-duality with the basic nature, that's also a realization of emptiness. The same emptiness, just realized with a different kind of mind. And people in different, like people who, I'm not just talking about Nyingmas and Kagyapas, I'm talking about Westerners who study, unlike me, for example, taking Gelugpa as my home base. If you take Westerners who studied with Nyingmas or they've studied with Kagyapas and they hear this, it's very hard for them because of how they've been trained to get their head around the idea that when you do a deconstructive logical analysis, that which you realize through that process is the same object, a sheer absence of intrinsic existence, that's also the experience of yogic direct perception on the path of seeing. It just seems evident to people outside Gelugpa that that's something different and more profound than the sheer negation of the self-nature of tables and chairs. Yeah. So this is how Karma puts it across. It's like someone saying that the mental representation of a vase is a vase. He's saying when you realize emptiness, you have a concept logically, you have a mental representation of emptiness, and that is obviously not emptiness. His system claims that having negated truth, one should not then negate the concept. This is Karma talking about Tsongkhapa. You should not then negate the conceptualization of the emptiness that is that negation. Right, Tsongkhapa says exactly that. He said, don't refute your own realization of emptiness. But then he quotes Perfection of Wisdom Sutra to show that, he thinks that why he thinks Tsongkhapa is wrong. the Buddha is speaking and says, even when they think these aggregates are empty, bodhisattvas are already still involved with signs of, reified qualities and things, and they lack faith in the unborn state. So the unborn, right, is the unborn. The idea of the unborn is in the Pali Canon as well. The unborn is seems to, in the Pali Canon, refer to nirvana, or ultimate reality. Another Perfection of Wisdom Sutra says, when it uses the expression form is empty, like we do in the Heart Sutra, one is using signs. And if you use the expression form is not empty, one is using signs. So signs here means, reified characteristics, characteristics that are reified in the mind as existing inherently. So as soon as we try to talk about whether form's empty or not, we're already caught. You can see that this is not something that was just made up by Hoshang Mahayana, who came over from China and had the wrong view. It's something that's present in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, from the very beginning. So his point is that these kinds of statements in the Perfection of Wisdom show that when you have to negate both extremes involved in dualistic grasping, and by that he means you have to negate empty as well as non-empty. The view that things are empty is, and Nagarjuna says that, emptiness is the, cure for other views. And actually that seems to be derived from a sutra. Emptiness is the cure for other views, but you become attached to emptiness, then you're going to be incurable. And so that's where Karamba is coming from. So I haven't quite finished with Karamba, but that's okay. The next place, he incorporates into his text, an interlocutor, an objection raiser who's raising objections from a Gelugpa point of view. So he can, he can show that he can understand and articulate the Gelugpa critique of his position, and then he has his own effort to rebut it. So now, at least, even though, we have one more session, I think I've said enough already for you to see, what my idea of these three different visions is. And also you can see that I maybe unconsciously, to some extent, cribbed it out of Karamba himself, because of course, that's how he structures it, is these three visions. But there's a lot of sense to it when you look at all these different texts, all the different things that Tibetans have said in trying to make sense out of Madhyamaka, that some of them clearly, go the Buddha nature route, and some of them, clearly go the sheer negation, the non-affirming negative emptiness, the sheer absence with nothing extra added of the, extra ontological mayonnaise that we smear onto top of things so as to become, greedy and angry about them. And then there's this third view, which is, you don't want to cling to empty and you don't want to cling to non-empty, and that what you're really aiming for is something that transcends both of those. Okay. I'm going to stop talking now, even though it's not quite 8:30. Somebody can ask a question if you want. Anyway, today was a little different because this was my original idea, is to do these talks because I've been doing these translations. And so, tonight I'm actually, like, most of what we saw is like actually right out of the texts that hold these points of view. Yeah.
Guy, wouldn't it seem that since there is such a vast difference in all of these philosophies and views that none of them have really seen emptiness, otherwise they'd all be talking about it the same way?
I don't believe that. And in fact, I think I think that people who have some kind of profound yogic experience they may have overlaps in the way they talk about it. And one of the overlaps is that it transcends language, it transcends conceptuality, that the experience is like water being poured into water, that the yogi doesn't experience her mind as something separate from the object that she's realizing, because her mind is empty and is realizing emptiness. So it's like and all of our, I don't know if I want to say, but almost all or most, I mean, it appears that our ordinary experience is just infused with a dualistic sense of the separation of subject and object. And I think that the idea that there's something that is inexpressible here, perhaps because it goes beyond the duality that's built into the way we talk. I think they all agree about that. They all agree about that. And given that they all agree about that, what do you do next? This is like, what was it? Katagiri Roshi, I think he said, well, you have to say something. Well, do you or don't you? I mean, you can choose to teach, but it's like Vimalakirti, when put on the spot, is how are you going to express non-duality? He uttered silence, right? And that's supposedly the same, as the Zen origin story, right? The Buddha just holds up a flower and doesn't say anything. So there's a way at pointing at what goes beyond language using silence, and there are different ways of using language to point at something that goes beyond language. And they all agree that it goes beyond language. They just don't agree on what kind of language we should use as stepping stones to transcending language. That's my point of view anyway.
Yeah, I was also going to say that last view felt very Zen to me.
Yeah.
And my question is, in terms of cultural context of when these views were built, is there something around the groups or the audience for these very different visions that would suggest that they were helpful for the folks at that time? Because I do see them all as being good medicine for various
Yeah.
minds.
Yeah.
So is there some cultural or social or context that would help me, audience that would help to understand which view might be more appropriate for a certain group of folks? Or
I mean, I have my own, okay, so the history of all these ideas is pretty complicated, and some parts of it aren't really well understood. One thing we can say is that there are a lot of Buddhists in India who were never really comfortable with the idea of a sheer negation being the fundamental reality of things. And there were others who were. and the ones who weren't comfortable with it, it's like, well, it's because they didn't feel that openness, this kind of openness that emptiness affords, they didn't feel like that was an adequate basis for practice. You can see Nagarjuna talking, he in the 24th chapter of the treatise on the middle way, he's got, a Buddhist who pops up and says, hey, all this emptiness talk, you just destroyed Buddhism. The whole Four Noble Truths is just wiped out. Well, that represents a real point of view that a lot of people held. And it wasn't like they all changed their mind after Nagarjuna finished writing, right? They want it, they need something more solid to base their faith on than, what to them sounds like nothing, right? It's actually not nothing, as we know, but it sounds like nothing, and maybe it feels like nothing to some people. And so they're like, well, that's not going to work as a starting point for my practice. And I think another thing that I can say that I think I talked about last time, at the beginning of last time, is that so, when you practice Tantra and you take to mind the idea that this is the body of the deity, partly this serves to counteract what Thupten Chodron called the poor quality view. In other words, we have this sense of self-deprecation, or we have these, we have negative attachments in relationship to ourselves, our own bodies, our own minds. And some people have that much worse than others, right? And I think that people who are strongly engaged in, seeing themselves in a very negative light, it can be inspiring and helpful to them to tell them that fundamentally you're a Buddha from the very beginning, or you're basically good, or, you have all these clouds, but they're passing over the clear sky of, perfect Buddha mind, which is already there in you. Do you know what I'm saying? People,
Yes.
If you say, well, people get off on that, they're deprecating it. It's a seriously healing message for people who need that kind of medicine. And I think there's that's why we have the Tathagata Sutras. It's, they're part of the Mahayana scriptures, whether they're, the part that we're used to focusing on. We don't start these sessions by chanting the Angulimala Sutra too often, right? I haven't actually seen that, but you understand there's kind of like, it's not like Tsongkhapa thinks that this is not the word of Buddha. He's just going to have a different way of explaining it. And yeah. So, yeah, and I think I don't know. I think it's a little hard for me to say beyond that, but I feel like Tsongkhapa's view is compatible with my personal personality and personal disposition in some way, right? But I know what you're saying about Zen. It's like, right, there's Zen teachers who talk about just don't know, right? As soon as you think you know something, right, then this whole thing of that not knowing, that there's a kind of, that real knowledge is attained by way of not knowing. So this is actually in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, where there's Buddha, I think Buddha is talking about, well, what is it like to see emptiness? It's like seeing space. You see by way of not seeing something that would be there, right? And so like that, there's this idea that true wisdom is attained by way of not holding on to any particular idea at all, right? And it's not only in Buddhism that's right. That is the skeptic tradition in the West. So skepticism was part of ancient Mediterranean world, but it comes down to Wittgenstein. I mean, it's part of what people do, is that they look at any position when grasped too tightly as potentially poison, right? And yeah, so this is something that, since you know, my home is in the Tsongkhapa to Dalai Lama lineage, but I have to be, I think I said this at the beginning, is like every medicine has counterindications and side effects. And there are side effects of the medicine that we prefer. And one of them is a tendency to feel subtly or subconsciously confirmed in our belief about the substantiality and reality of those conventional things we see around us. It's like, oh yeah, you know, tables and chairs, I always thought they exist, and now Tsongkhapa goes through a lot of complicated philosophy to tell me I was right, you know. And what's missing is something I never heard of before, this inherent existence thing, right? So I'm not making this up as a criticism of Gelugpa. Gelugpas have given this criticism with, you know, people, smart people within the tradition have pointed this out as a pitfall. Personally, when I read Tsongkhapa, I do not see him falling into this pitfall. But on the other hand, he doesn't necessarily write. He's very concerned about you know, protecting people against nihilistic understandings of Tantra, for example. And in the process, you know, people who come later tend to stress the validity of the conventional so much that the you know, the side effect is to tend to take the world as it appears, as the true nature of things, when that's not actually the teaching at all. There's one, you know, I was just forgetting exactly who it is. It's the seventh Dalai Lama or somebody has this text where they say it's like, you know, for Gelugpas who don't really understand, haven't really meditated on it, just haven't really done the practice, and they just hear these words and then they parrot them. It's like you put a hat on your head and then you learn to take it off again. And you're just the same as you were before, right? Yeah, because it's all these conventions are perfectly valid. They're conventionally real is the real, you know? Yeah, that's the downside. That is a downside. And for me, I don't see that as a nihilistic extreme at all. But that's because I'm, you know, I'm looking in terms of the pitfall, in terms of the conventional. But Karamba was saying, you know, he wanted to show that, you know, Dolpopo was an eternalist in terms of the ultimate. And so, you know, he focused symmetrically on looking at how Tsongkhapa sees the ultimate as a sheer negation, as opposed to this, you know, hyper positive vision of the extrinsic emptiness people. But I also mentioned, I mean, last class, that this extrinsic emptiness view is, it's not just that it's helpful to a few people here or there. It could be, you know, half the Tibetan Buddhist world. Yeah. So if we're, you know, I don't know. You know, His Holiness is dedicated to being the leader of all the Tibetan Buddhists, not just the ones who agree with Tsongkhapa, right? And so he has to find ways of first of all, understanding in a deep way what these other systems are saying, and then trying to see how he can talk about them in ways that are not just sympathetic, but are insightful in terms of how they can be pointing towards the same kind of, how they can be leading for different people towards the same type of awakening, ultimately. The first time I ever saw him do that was in the book Kindness, Clarity, and Insight. Very old book, right? By His Holiness, collection of essays. But the last couple essays in that book are very, very, you know, it's completely original thought. And you could say that it's in the RIME tradition, it's part of this tradition of saying, you know, as Tibetan Buddhists, we're not just about following, you know, first what Tsongkhapa said and then what Gyaltsab said, what Kadrup said, what Jamyang Sheva said, and then what our guru said, we can look at, you know, what other people have said as well and try to understand, you know, what they're doing in a sympathetic way. There's nobody better. I mean, there's a lot of great Rime writers, but unfortunately, most of them have not been sympathetic or very inclusive toward Gelugpa. They've created bridges between Sakya, Kagyu, and Nyingma, and the bridges to Gelugpa are very, very thin and shaky. And His Holiness basically, that's where I see him. You know, he's basically, he doesn't. I've never heard him call himself Rime, but he's a Gelugpa, but he has this spirit of looking beyond the boundaries of Gelugpa and being inclusive of the perspectives of different groups of Tibetan Buddhists. And that's specifically why, well, anyway, that's one aspect, right, of why there's some ultra-Orthodox fundamentalist so-called Gelugpas who reject His Holiness's leadership, because they think that to follow Tsongkhapa, you should not talk about or study or even read books from outside that lineage. Yes, Amy, is that right?
Question, would then Tantra and Mahamudra take you beyond these distinctions? And then that was one thing that I wanted to say, and the other was His Holiness also often goes back to the fifth Dalai Lama, who is Nyingma, and so, or at least in his view, I think. And so it's almost as if he's speaking from his whole being of his past lives and present lives together. Would you say? Would you comment on both of those thoughts?
Well, yeah, you know that His Holiness, you know, does understand himself as being a further emanation of the beings who emanated, a being who emanated as the prior Dalai Lamas. But in terms of his direct experience of that, he's really emphasized his, you know, dreams, visions, experiences relating, you know, conveying a sense of identity with the fifth Dalai Lama. And it's true that the fifth Dalai Lama was, although it was under his auspices that the Jonang books were sealed up and the Jonang monastery was converted to Gelug, but in other ways, he sort of set this model of being studying things and taking seriously and practicing things that weren't necessarily in the Gelugpa lineage. And so I think that's probably part of, you know, to be the Dalai Lama is different from being, you know, the abbot of a Gelugpa monastery. Right? And you have to,
or even the head of the Gelugpas.
Right. Oh yeah, exactly. That's an even better example, right? Tantra and Mahamudra. Well, so I think you know, when you look at Nyingma, for example, some of the ways that His Holiness talks about Kala Chakra a lot, and you know, some of the highest yoga tantra practices that are regarded as the highest kinds of practices of tantra in Gelugpa are not regarded as the highest kinds of practices in other orders. There is a Gelug Mahamudra tradition, right? And it's not as important in Gelugpa as it is in Kagyupa, but it exists in a legitimate way, transmitted down to today. So maybe the real difference is like when you're doing the practice, whether it's, you know, Mahamudra or however, whatever kinds of practice or whatever kind of practice you're doing, a tantric practice, what is the view? How do you understand the view? Like, you know, obviously the deity that you're visualizing yourself is not inherently existent. But what is the fundamental nature that you have in common with the Buddha you're visualizing? Do you see what I'm saying? And
so does that bring then the two together at that point?
well, I'm saying that when people talk about what is the basic view that you're bringing to mind when you're cultivating the view as part of a tantric practice, it's going to be different if you're doing it in Kagyapa versus if you're doing it in, right? Because they're using different words to think about what the, I mean, if you assume people are practicing at the level of not, you know, if they're at the stage of generation and they're doing these kinds of practices, they you know, are starting with words and ideas to generate experiences, and the words and ideas they use are going to be different if they're in these different lineages.
But if Dzogchen is part of all of those lineages, and Mahamudra is, then is it where? How does that relate to what you're saying about this view of Buddha nature versus emptiness from Tsongkhapa?
So the thing is that I would just tell you what I've heard His Holiness, read him say or heard him say about these things. You know, he has said, I've heard him say that there is a good kind of extrinsic emptiness view and a bad kind of extrinsic emptiness view. And I think, you know, if he's identified with the fifth Dalai Lama, it's clear that, you know, the bad kind of extrinsic emptiness view is one that's totally reifying of the Dharma Dhatu, of the sphere of reality. And I think His Holiness wants to find a view where it's unnecessarily dualistic to get into an argument about whether the fundamental nature is a sheer negation or whether it's a fundamentally pure mind of clear light that is empty. And the emptiness of the mind of clear light and the mind of clear light are non-dual. Do you know what I'm saying? So it's like, and then if you think about it from that point of view, then it's like, well, you can do Dzogchen practice, but is the Dharma Dhatu itself taken as being intrinsically real, such that it makes all of these things, you know, actually utterly non-existent? Yeah, that's a difference. I would suggest, so I'm very limited in what I can really say about that, but the place to start, in my opinion, is the last two essays in Kindness, Clarity, and Insight. He does just it's very, I mean, I didn't appreciate, I heard him give those talks.
Wow.
And I didn't understand a word of it. And I had no idea what he was doing, how sophisticated it was. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you, everybody.
Say goodnight. Thank you, guys. This is really wonderful, thought-provoking.
Thank you for listening. Yeah, we'll see next time. I guess we'll finish up Karamba, and then I'm thinking maybe to do a little bit of Mipam, and you know, and then maybe looking back at what we've covered from a Gelugpa point of view again. I don't have it all mapped out, but those are sort of the things I'm thinking about. Also, another thing I'm thinking about is Jonathan asked me, a couple of people have asked me questions that I either, you know, Jonathan asked me this question about what exactly we mean by non-dual. And that turns out to be, there's a lot to say about that. And I might talk about that a little bit next time. And then the idea of like, what kinds of consciousnesses can know the basic reality. You're talking about it's like what, becoming liberate from needless misery by seeing the basic reality of things. But what kinds of consciousnesses can know or already know that basic reality? So Tsongkhapa is like stressing that conceptual minds can know the basic reality and they need to know it, right? And also, following Chandrakirti, he doesn't believe in reflexive self-awareness that exists at all, let alone that it's in any way connected with knowing the ultimate reality. But I don't know if you picked up on that in the quotes, but this is, in other traditions, this idea of Rangrik or reflexive self-awareness, it's critical to their idea of the path and this idea that we already have this Buddha wisdom within us, So yeah, we'll talk a little bit about that. Okay. Thank you, everybody. And
can I put your email in the chat again?
Yes, please do. Yeah, I'll do my best to
thank you.
To answer people's questions. Yeah. Okay. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.